Welcome back to Dr. B Teaches and the 7th Generation Podcast. I'm your host of the show, Dr. B. Today we're diving into a powerful and necessary conversation about language, culture, and history. Kendrick Lamar recently dropped a new album, and like many of you, I love his music. I've been listening to him for years. And on the first track of his new album, there was a word that he mentions that caught my attention. And many people don't know that this word is in fact a racial slur. So I'm going to say the word one time, and after that, I'm going to refer to it as the E words. The word I'm talking about is Eskimo. And so the E word is filled with a history of stereotypes and settler colonial violence. So in this episode, I want to explore why the word is harmful, how it was used to dehumanize Inuit communities, and how this dehumanization justified acts of colonial violence, like the mass slaughter of Inuit dogs in the 1950s and the 1960s, something that I just recently learned about. So I want to talk more about that story, but I also want to go further. I want to talk about the everyday words and the phrases that many of us use, not knowing that these terms are rooted in colonialism that perpetuate stereotypes about Indigenous peoples, and how all of us can do better. So it's more than just a conversation about language. It's also about respect, understanding, and healing. So let's jump in. Let's begin with the E word. For many people, it might seem like an outdated term, but for the Inuit and the Indigenous peoples of the Arctic, it's a slur. It's a term imposed by outsiders, and it's tied to harmful stereotypes and settler colonial violence. The word, the E word, was never chosen by the Inuit peoples and their relatives. It was a label that was forced upon them by settlers. And early interpretations of the word they vary. And there isn't a clear and one single definition. Some people have defined it as eaters of raw meat, a phrase definitely that dehumanizes Arctic Indigenous peoples and reduces their culture to a stereotype. But let's be clear, this is a racial slur. The people of the Arctic, the Indigenous peoples there, did not refer to themselves as the E word. This is a colonial word that is imposed on them. This isn't just about semantics, however. It's about identity, and it's about autonomy, self-determination, sovereignty, these significant phrases that are very meaningful to Indigenous communities. Because the Inuit people and all the communities in the Arctic suffered through decades of colonial violence. And I want to talk about one particular situation, the slaughter of Inuit dogs, Inuit sled dogs, and how this devastated several Indigenous communities of the Arctic. So words like the E word strip away the rich diversity and the humanity of Indigenous communities. And this is something that we've seen with colonial language really since the beginning and the advent of settler colonialism starting in the Western Hemisphere in 1492. And of course, all the correct terms were slowly erased, and all these colonial terms were slowly imposed on Indigenous communities. So the correct term would be Inuit, but there are several communities with several different specific names that identify them as a distinct group. And I think it's important for us to recognize that much of our language that we use, especially in places like the United States and Canada, is a settler colonial language. And so choosing the right words is one small but significant step toward respect and reconciliation. And I always encourage people, wherever you live, it doesn't matter if you live in California, or you live in New York, or you live somewhere in Canada, there were Indigenous people who occupied that territory forever, since time immemorial. And those Indigenous communities probably still exist. And so it's really incumbent on you to educate yourself about the land that you live on, and also to do your best to learn the correct terms. and to unlearn some of the settler colonial language that all of us were taught. Even indigenous people who were forced into the boarding schools or who attended some type of public school system were also indoctrinated into this settler colonial language. Now let's talk about one of the most devastating examples of how dehumanization can lead to settler violence. And I'm referring to the mass slaughter of Inuit sled dogs in the 1950s and the 1960s. And during this time, more than 1,000 sled dogs are killed in Nunavik, northern Quebec. But I have learned that sled dogs were killed all over Inuit territories. And these dogs are more than just animals. They were a lifeline to these people. They helped Inuit families hunt, travel, and survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. So without them, survival would have been nearly impossible. But colonial authorities, police mounties, employees of the Hudson Bay Company, and others carried out these systematic killings. They shot the dogs, often in front of families and children. And you could imagine the scene. Kids seeing these dogs that they've raised up since they were pups being killed right in front of them. And some of these dogs did not die instantly. They were left there to suffer before they died, and eventually they'd have their bodies buried. So you could imagine the trauma of watching your lifeline, your independence, your way of life being destroyed literally before your eyes. And the official justification for doing this was safety concerns. But let's be real, this was about social control. By taking away their sled dogs, settlers forced Inuit families into permanent settlements, making them dependent on expensive and unreliable snowmobiles. And so you had a people who were completely autonomous and eventually had their sovereignty completely stripped from them. So this wasn't just an attack on animals, it was literally an attack on Inuit independence, mobility, and culture. I also wanted to mention too that some of these dogs were also poisoned as well. In addition, settlers would go to these communities and untie these dogs, knowing full well that these dogs would be killed if they were seen running free. And so this was a concerted effort to completely wreck a way of life. Despite the trauma and settler violence, Inuit communities have displayed incredible resilience. They continue to practice sled dog culture and hold sled dog races to honor a way of life that they've been practicing for hundreds of years. So the federal government was unable to completely destroy this way of life, thankfully. Also, recently, the federal government in Canada has issued a formal public apology to the Inuit. They've also pledged some $45 million to Inuit communities. Some of that money is going to go to language and culture revitalization programs, which will include programs to help the continual revitalization of sled dog culture in the Arctic. And so this is definitely a step in the right direction, but a lot of Inuit leaders have said that this is just the beginning. If there's going to be real reconciliation, apologies simply are not enough. It requires addressing the systems of power and oppression that created this harm in the first place. Now let's turn our attention to another form of harm that's deeply rooted in colonialism, and I'm referring to some of the terms and phrases that we use without knowing their colonial origin. And we need to keep in mind that the language that we use is a reflection of our worldview, and words shape how we see the world. And so if the words that we're using are rooted in violence, they perpetuate harm, even if that's not our intention. And there's a whole list of phrases and terms that we need to stop using, especially if you're an educator. The first one is sit Indian style. This phrase reduces Native peoples to a stereotype. It's really easy to say sit cross-legged. Too many chiefs, not enough Indians. I've heard this my entire life. This saying trivializes indigenous leadership. A chief is a revered leader. Hold down the fort. This phrase comes from settler history, where forts were used to defend against indigenous people who were looking to defend their homelands. Rain dance. I've heard this a lot as well over the years. Let's have a powwow. A powwow is a social gathering. It's a Native American event, not just some casual meeting. Off the reservation is also a term. This phrase, it has deep colonial roots. And of course, Native Americans were forced to live on reservations and were not allowed to leave. And so off the reservation was a term that was used to say, hey, these people are illegally leaving this concentration camp where we have placed them to die. And so off the reservation seems harmless, but it has deep colonial, deep settler colonial meaning. How Indian are you is a question that you shouldn't ask. This question's invasive. It's tied to ideas of blood quantum and racial purity. Indian giver. This phrase twists indigenous practices of sharing and reciprocity into a stereotype that Native Americans are dishonest. That if you're an Indian giver, you give something and then you take it away. And I've heard this again for years. Since I was a little kid, I remember people throwing around that term. Circle the wagons. This saying romanticizes settler violence against Native peoples. The S word, and I'll say it one time. The word is squaw. We call it the S word. It is a slur. It's one of the most offensive terms to Native women, and it's rooted in colonial violence towards Native women, colonial sexism, and there really is no place for that word ever to be used. It's never really okay. Now, I did a really good episode, I feel, with one of my friends, Roman Raintree, and I would really encourage all of you to check it out. And he led a campaign to change some of these place names. And I think you'd really enjoy it. I encourage you guys to check it out. I was able to sit down with him and his son earlier this year and really get an education. And so the S word, don't use it. It's offensive, and it just shouldn't be said any longer. Low man on the totem pole. I've heard this often as well. Asking somebody what their spirit animal is. This trivializes sacred indigenous spiritual practices. And it also is just an absurd question. Why would you ask anybody that? When we use these terms, we're not just being insensitive, we're perpetuating the erasure and the dehumanization of indigenous peoples. And that's the thing about settler colonial language and how it develops. It dehumanizes people to the point to where we don't even see these communities that have been here since time immemorial, the First Nations people. We don't even see them as real human beings. So it's time to be more mindful of our language and the impact that it has. And if you're an educator, you really need to stop using these terms. And if you are in a position of power and you hear these terms being used, I would encourage you to do your best to educate individuals about how we shouldn't use these terms. So how does Kendrick Lamar fit into the conversation? As I said earlier, I don't believe Kendrick used the E word with any malicious intent. He's an artist known for challenging systemic oppression and inequality. But even someone as thoughtful as Kendrick can be wrong. And he was wrong in using the word. So I take it as an opportunity to help people understand that there are phrases that we shouldn't use any longer. There are words that are racial slurs that are rooted in settler violence, that some people just don't know the history. And I'm assuming that Kendrick doesn't. So for Kendrick, it's a chance for him to educate themselves. It's a chance for all of us to recognize that language does matter. Words have the power to harm or heal, to uplift or to erase. And if we truly care about justice and equity, we have to start by examining the words we use and understanding their colonial histories. So to Kendrick, if you're listening, I hope that this inspires you to address this situation. He's probably not listening, but it would be pretty cool if he was. And to anyone else, let's commit to decolonizing our language and supporting Indigenous communities in their fight for sovereignty, respect, and justice. We have to all do our part. And I know myself, looking at some of these phrases, when I was raised, this was just normal. And it's just taking us decades of educating and unlearning settler colonial concepts and terms. And it's not easy. It's not an easy thing to do, especially if you were educated here in the United States or Canada, if you went to a public school or residential school or boarding school. And we're just having to unlearn a lot of what settler colonialism has taught us. And unfortunately and sadly, there's a lot of these terms that are still in use, and many of them are incredibly offensive, including the E word and the S word. All right, I want to thank everybody for joining me for this important conversation about settler colonial terms and phrases that are really harmful and damaging. If you learned something in this episode, I encourage you to share it. If you are checking out Dr. B Teaches on YouTube, please subscribe to my channel. You can follow me on Instagram. My Instagram handle is 7Gen Podcast. 7th Generation Podcast streams on all major platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. I'm also on TikTok. Merciless Savages is my handle there. And I always encourage people to share all my content with your friends and family members. I'm always learning. I don't know everything by all means. I'm always doing my best to learn and also to unlearn some of the stereotypes that I was indoctrinated to believe that they were okay. And so remember, we're the 7th generation. What we do today matters. How we live our lives, how we speak to other people really does have an impact. And just want everybody to recognize that. And I think that Kendrick Lamar's album is really amazing. I'm not trying to cancel Kendrick, so what I'm trying to do is take this time to educate people about how harmful settler colonial language is. And it has been incredibly harmful to the Inuit, and it did lead, in my view, to this attitude that these people, these communities, were not real human beings. And it led to the dehumanization, which led to the killing, the mass slaughter of these amazing dogs. So I'm Dr. B, and it's been a pleasure to be with you today. Until next time, later.